Broadcasting live from the Subaru of Gwinnett studio inside the Sonesta Gwinnett Place Atlanta Hotel. It's time for Travel Safely with Bryan Mulligan. Travel Safely is presented by Applied Information, creator of the Travel Safely smartphone app.
Welcome, everybody, to Travel Safely, the business talk show bringing you the latest in innovation from transportation, technology, and entrepreneurship. I'm your host, Bryan Mulligan, coming to you from the Subaru Business RadioX studio in Gwinnett, Georgia. This show is sponsored by Applied Information, a technology company here in Gwinnett, focused on using technology to save lives, improve traffic, and to drive commerce. Safety is a major question in the transportation industry. 40,000 people in the United States die on the roads each year, and millions more are injured. Something has to be done, and we at Travel Safely are trying to address these problems in a new way. Our guest today is Eric Tanenblatt, who is the Global Chair, Public Policy and Regulation with Denton's law firm. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, welcome. So the topic of the day we're going to try and chat about is trying to improve the safety and effectiveness of the transportation using connected, autonomous, and electric vehicles. Those are all the buzzwords that we're talking about. So, Eric, thanks for joining me on the show.
Happy to be here.
So firstly, we're all humans. It's a public interest side. Tell us a little bit about the Eric Tanenblatt story and how did you end up in Denton's in your current role?
Well, I have spent my entire career in and around government. I've worked for 3 presidents. I worked for President George H.W. Bush in the late 80s. I worked for a United States Senator from Georgia, Paul Coverdale, in the 90s. I worked for President George W. Bush. And in 2001, I joined the law firm of Long, Aldridge, and Norman, which is no longer in existence. It merged in and became McKenna, Long, and Aldridge, which is also no longer in existence because it merged in and became Denton's. And Denton's is now the largest law firm in the world with over 12,000 employees. We are in 175. We have 175 offices in 75 countries and continuing to grow.
Wow, that's quite a story. So you were in Washington, D.C.?
I did. I lived in Washington, and I lived here in Atlanta now 30 years.
Okay. Well, that gives you kind of a unique perspective because one of the things that we have is that the surface transportation network is run by the government today. I mean, that's just the reality since the Eisenhower interstate system and local roads, there's city, county, and state governments running the roads. And now we get to this situation of all these deaths and problems, and everybody looks at the government and says, so what are you going to do about this? And I think that's one of the things we're going to try and talk about together, because you've got a great perspective of the government side of us, and I'm obviously a private sector technology guy all these years. What are we going to do together to try and solve these problems?
Well, it's going to require the partnership of the private sector and the government. There's some big challenges within the government, especially as you mentioned at the top of the show about autonomous vehicles, because this is a whole new area of technology. Currently, the federal government has historically regulated the vehicle, and the state has regulated the drivers. Well, now the drivers are the vehicle, or they're actually the vehicle's the driver in autonomous vehicles. So this is a whole new area, and it's a whole area that is going to require a lot of regulation. And the technology is moving so fast, so quickly, that I'm not sure our policymakers are equipped to put the appropriate laws and regulations in place. And that's why I think the private sector can play a key role in that.
I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I'm a technology guy, and so I always say that those of us in the private sector technology space, we always have the ability to overwhelm the government's ability to regulate us.
Right.
Regulation always comes after the innovation. And that's a fundamental question of the federal government's role in regulating vehicles and the state's role in regulating drivers, and then the city and county's role in managing the road network. So we actually cut across all sections of government. in addressing this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why you're seeing so many companies out there testing the technology and gathering the data is so that when our policymakers do come around to having to put laws and regulations in place, they can make decisions based on data. Companies like Waymo, which is probably one of the leaders in autonomous driving. I mean, they have millions and millions of miles of testing that's been done. And so they have all of this data. Other auto manufacturers, whether it's or ride-sharing companies, but you have Ford, you have General Motors, you have the ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft, of course Tesla. They're all gathering a whole lot of data as it relates to autonomous technology. And that data is going to be critically important, as our lawmakers, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, start putting appropriate regulations in place. The other thing, too, is with autonomous vehicles, electrification sort of leads to autonomy.
They go together.
They do. And what you're seeing is certain jurisdictions here in the United States in particular that have created a climate that has been welcoming towards electric vehicles, have seen the testing of autonomous vehicles more readily than those states that have not shown sort of an appetite for electric vehicles. The best example would be right here in the state of Georgia. In 2015, Georgia was number 2 in the country in terms of electric vehicles. And then our legislature got rid of the electric vehicle tax credit. We're now at the back of the pack. There was a 90% decline in the sale of electric vehicles in the state of Georgia.
Right.
And as a result of that, we're sort of behind the curve in Georgia in terms of the testing of autonomous vehicles. And you look at what's going on in California or Arizona. Arizona is like ground zero in Phoenix. And again, it was political leadership in the state of Arizona. Governor Ducey, the governor of Arizona, proactively went and recruited autonomous vehicle testing to come to Arizona and wanted to be at the forefront. And I think you're going to see autonomous vehicles. They are already deployed in Arizona, but they're becoming more common. And you're seeing it in Northern California as well. And I think that these states that are the early adopters are going to be far ahead and at a greater advantage than those states that aren't. And so there's an example of policy as it relates to electric vehicles and the infrastructure that's needed for electric vehicles. It's not just a tax credit. The tax credit was to stimulate the market, but we now need to play catch up, and we need to build the infrastructure so that people are more willing to go out and buy an electric vehicle because they're coming. You could look at all the auto manufacturers and they're all producing electric vehicles.
Right, and in fact that this is a paradigm shift. In fact, I was at a focus group today talking about what change, we're in Georgia here, and so what changes potentially are in front of the Georgia Department of Transportation. And it's quite an interesting thing for an organization like that that's been in business for many, many years building roads. And we're technology guys, and the business of trying to buy technology for the roadway with the asset purchase systems that work for buying concrete and asphalt actually just don't work very well. And so I say that in the private sector, we do certain things well, but there are 2 things that we can't do. The first is public policy. What is the political will of the people? That's a government role. And the second one is safety. You touched on that. And that's where there's some track record in that area. We've built motor cars with, let's have a pickup truck with a steering column that was a solid rod, and you had a relatively minor accident, and it would make a hole in your chest and kill you. So we went from there to having NHTSA, the federal guys who regulate the industry, and now we've got airbags and collapsible steering columns and seat belts and all kinds of regulations, which I think the general populace would say has been a good thing we've made for safer motor vehicles. Because that's an interesting thing that we in the private sector can't really do, is all the car companies had what they called safety packages, and nobody ever bought them. because people, as it seems, just don't buy safety. They think themselves invincible, and accidents happen to other people. So do you see any sense of this? Is the folks who adopting autonomous vehicles and advocating for them, like Arizona, focused on public policy and then leaving the implementation, trying to frame safety, but then leaving the implementation of autonomous vehicles, that gets left to the private sector?
Absolutely. I mean, all of the testing is being done by the private sector, and they're the ones that are developing the technology. And the states are trying to that are promoting autonomous testing are trying to give the private sector as much flexibility so that they can develop products that are going to ultimately be safer for the population. 80+% of accidents that occur today is by human error.
Right.
And so when we move to autonomous vehicles, there's going to be a dramatic drop. I mean, you're not going to have people that are going to be hitting the brake and creating these accidents, because what will ultimately happen is vehicles will be talking to vehicles, and we're going to cut down on the accidents and make things a lot safer. I happen to be one of the people, and people debate with me on this as well, but I think come 10 years from now, it's going to be very different in terms of who actually owns a car. I think we're moving more towards ride-sharing fleets. Right. And that's going to be a big game changer. Right now, I think they say 95% of the time, most of our cars sit idle in a garage or in a parking lot, and we're only using them 4 or 5% of the time. Well, if you have these ride-sharing fleets, they'll be on the road 95% of the time. And the other thing, too, is as we move towards electric vehicles, the distance that an electric vehicle, the lifespan of an electric vehicle, is so much greater than a combustible engine vehicle. A combustible engine vehicle, their lifespan's about 150 to 200,000 miles. Electric vehicles can go 500 to 1 million miles.
Right.
So, I mean, that's going to be a paradigm shift. I believe that children born today may never learn how to drive. And if we move to a society where we have autonomous vehicle fleets, then the owner of the vehicle is going to be whoever's managing the fleet as opposed to the individual. So the individual will no longer need to be paying for insurance. Whoever's running the fleets will cover the insurance. However, the insurance cost should decline because there'll be less human error. And so that's going to put more disposable income in the hands of all of us.
Efficiency drives the cost of everything
Right.
down. So for our friends who might be listening in the public sector who worrying, about making laws and regulations, what do you see the biggest regulatory hurdles right now? What do you see?
Well, I touched on with regards to electrification and electric vehicles. I think there needs to be policy to incentivize the deployment of more infrastructure. One of the challenges with electric vehicles, and one of the hesitations a lot of people have, is they can't go the distance they need to go. Now, battery technology, in addition to declining the technology in cost, the technology is getting better that you can go longer distances. However, you still can't go some of the distances that you would need if, say, you wanted to go from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. You're going to need to, at some point, stop and charge your vehicle along the way. And so for long distances, I think we're going to need to demonstrate that we have the infrastructure to support electric vehicles. So that's one particular area. And then if you look at, we're just talking about individuals and vehicles, but from a logistics standpoint, I think one of the areas where we may actually see them deployed sooner than cars in the main is trucks. Right. And that's one area where state departments of transportation can be preparing for. There's something called platooning, right, where trucks follow one another, and maybe you have a driver in the first truck and the others are just following. There are things that can be done in terms of dedicated lanes for freight. And so I think that there's a number of areas where our policymakers can be looking at ways in which they can advance the deployment of these vehicles, and also smart technology like what your company is doing, working the project with the city of Atlanta and other projects that you're doing to create smart technology with synchronization of traffic lights and making it a lot easier for cars to make their way down the different roadways.
Fantastic. So after the break, Eric, we're going to talk a little bit about what can technology in the private sector do to help. We've got some thoughts I want to talk to you about, and also some shared Tesla stories, because I know we both drive Teslas. So on that note, it's 30 Seconds with Sarah.
Thanks, Brian. Filling in for Sarah this time, I'm Bill Wells. Rush hours really are the worst, and Atlanta rush hours can be some of the worst in the nation, if not the entire world. The ATL routinely ranks in the top 10 for really bad traffic. But which Atlanta rush hour is the worst, morning or evening? According to the Georgia Department of Transportation, or GDOT, it's the evening. Seems like more of us are in more of a hurry to get home than get to work. Here's the numbers. You'll average 33 miles an hour on the most congested metro freeways going home, and a blistering 37 miles an hour getting to work. There is light at the end of at least one of these tunnels. GDOT plans to open up some additional express lanes on the north side of town in the not too distant future, so you may pay your way to a faster commute. Filling in for Sarah, she's back next time. I'm Bill Wells.
So thanks, Eric, for joining me today. In case you're just joining us, this is Travel Safely with Bryan Mulligan. How to save lives, improve traffic, drive commerce, and help the environment, with our guest Eric Tanenblatt from Dentons. So Eric, before we get on to talking about Tesla and our shared experience with electric and autonomous vehicles, let's touch on two private sector things which people often ask me about when we come to autonomous vehicles. How's that going to reshape the insurance environment?
Well, I think it's going to drop insurance costs. There was a study about a year and a half ago by Aon, which is one of the larger insurers, that said that there'll be a drop roughly 30+% in insurance premiums as a result of autonomous vehicles because of the safety issue. And we talked about that earlier, but if you're dealing with computers talking to computers, cars talking to cars, you're going to have less accidents. And there was the accident recently with Uber, which we've now learned after they studied that it was human error.
Human error, yeah.
That gets a lot of news, but there are far more accidents that are occurring with combustible engine vehicles every single day than that one that occurred.
Interestingly, a person gets killed as a pedestrian every 3.6 hours.
Right.
So those are the numbers. Yes, that one made the news, but the 4 other people who died that day, or 6 other people who died that day, didn't make the news.
But that's because the technology is new, and people have sort of this fear of the unknown. But I think it's going to become more mainstream, which is another thing that I've told people why I'm such a big advocate for testing, and why I think we should have testing here in the state of Georgia, because I think the more people see these vehicles, like the shuttles on North Avenue, the more they see it and they see that it's real and that it works, I think the more accepting they'll be when they become more mainstream.
Yeah, Faye DeMassimo, when she was running the program, had a great expression, and that was socializing the technology.
Right.
That was a key part of her mission, is get everybody seeing it, get everybody used to it, because it's coming.
Absolutely. And it's also a lot less expensive than some of the more traditional modes of transportation that we've been accustomed to. And there's a lot of debate just about every city and state about rail and putting in more rail. And that is such an it's very expensive to put in rail. It takes a long time to do it as well, where you can plop down an autonomous shuttle a lot quicker. I mean, this is an interesting, someone told me this the other day, which sort of blew me away about cars, that combustible engine cars have over 2,000 parts, where electric vehicles have 18. So if you start thinking about shuttles, how quickly it could be, you could actually manufacture a autonomous electric shuttle with a 3D printer.
Right. Yeah, there are some guys doing that. Familiar with that. The other question that when we're talking about autonomous cars, and there's all this various levels and things like that, is what's law enforcement going to do? What is your local cop going to do when he tries to pull over an autonomous vehicle? I mean, should he be able to electronically do that? If he Must it recognize his lights? And what happens when he gets there to write the thing a ticket and there's nobody in the driver's seat?
Yeah, I mean, those are very good questions. I mean, there's going to be a lot of questions like that. You hope to think, though, that when we have autonomous vehicles on the street, there again will be technology to figure out who's responsible for that. And hopefully they won't be speeding because they'll be following the laws and they'll be programmed to follow the laws.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe that's another business opportunity for me. I hadn't actually thought about that.
Yeah, I
but
think it's
maybe
a
I
great
should
one.
be in the law enforcement of autonomous vehicles. Maybe that's an entrepreneurial opportunity. Teslas.
Yes, great vehicle. Best car I've ever had.
Likewise. We both drive them.
Yes.
I wasn't a Tesla fan when I bought my car. I bought it because I wanted to experience electric, connected, and autonomous, and was this for real? And so what is your experience as an electric, connected, and autonomous vehicle driver?
Well, as I said, it's the best car I've ever had. It's amazing. I've had it for 2.5 years. I haven't been to a gas station. That's a big plus. Quiet.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt you there because I've got this little story about people who say about the gas station thing, And I say, so one of the things that people who drive gasoline cars do, they go to this vaguely sketchy, dangerous place that you always feel unsafe in the middle of the night. You put this smelly, explosive fluid in your vehicle right next to your children. And somehow you think that that's a good idea and that electrification's not coming at you.
That's right. That's right. And I think that there's another business opportunity too, especially along the interstate. I think someone needs to prepare for all of these charging stations. And, the charging technology has become so advanced that you could do it quicker. Probably still not as quick as how, the time it takes to fill a car with gas. So, whether it's Waffle House or Starbucks or someone, there needs to be places for people to go while their cars are charging.
Right.
It's a whole new business opportunity. But I think back to the Tesla, in addition to not having to go to a gas station and how quiet it is and how environmentally, sound it is, I am just amazed at the technology. And the thing that really gets me is Tesla's really only level 3 of level 5. So it is not even doing all that autonomous vehicles can do, and yet it is so much more advanced than just a regular combustible engine vehicle.
And when you're driving down the interstate and driving to Florida, my story is that my wife was in the passenger seat next to me with her eyes closed. And I said, "But dear, you never drive with me with your eyes closed." And with her eyes closed, she said, "I'm happy to keep my eyes closed because there's somebody else looking over your shoulder." And that really is the sense. I think that there's an extra driver in the car helping you drive.
Absolutely, and you see it all the time. If you move over to a lane, it lets you know. There are so many warning signals, and then if you turn it on to autopilot, I mean, that is just a fascinating technology, especially on the interstate. You just have to make sure you don't fall asleep because because it really does take over the car.
And drives like a co-pilot as it
does.
That's all fascinating. Private sector capital. I'm an entrepreneur. You've got all this experience in government. Where should I invest my money?
Well, I talked about electric vehicles. They're going to happen, and the battery technology has declined so much
in cost,
and the technology has improved too. And then the other area is autonomous vehicles, the technology used for autonomous vehicles, the LiDAR technology. That technology has declined in cost as well. So I would look at the if you're talking about investments, personal or from a company standpoint, I'd look at the technologies that are being used for both electric vehicles and for autonomous vehicles, because I think that we're gonna move in that direction, and that's really the future.
Yeah, I think I can echo that back. That there's no doubt it's coming. It might be 1 year, it might be 2 years, it might be 5 years.
Someone told me recently that it took 30 years back in the 40s and 50s for people to embrace the refrigerator. And I also saw a study that was done in 1990 by a large consulting firm about the adoption of cellular phones. And back then in 1990, we had those bricks, those
Yes.
brick phones. And they predicted by the end of the decade, this would be 1999, 2000, there'd be 900,000 people with these phones. It ends up it was 100 million. And so, if you look 30 years for the refrigerator, a decade to get to 100 million in the 90s with the cell phone, disruption when it happens fast. And I think that's what's going to happen with electric vehicles.
It certainly seems to be coming. So you're the global chair of your practice, and so you've got this perspective from around the world. What lessons can we learn here in Georgia, maybe from some of the things you've seen around the world? So, and what can we do as far as regulation and policy and government affairs, which is your area? What can we do?
Well, there are certain areas around the world where they're moving quicker than we are here in the United States. And there's a lot going on in the United States. And I don't want to sound like there's not a lot going on in Georgia. I just think that given the innovative, nature of our state and the city of Atlanta, I think there's a whole lot more we can be doing. But looking around the world, China is moving very quickly,
Yes.
and that shouldn't surprise anyone. And they've got cars on the road, they've got trucks on the road. You're seeing it in Germany. You could just go around the globe. In Singapore, for example, they were the first country that were testing autonomous taxis. The company that was testing autonomous taxis about 2 years ago, a company called Nutonomy, which is out of Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than testing those vehicles in the United States, they were testing them in Singapore. Now they're now testing them in the United States. But I think that you're seeing other, and you could identify the countries are the ones that are more technologically savvy and advanced and have the resources are out testing the vehicles. So I think it's going to be sort of a competition as to who's going to get there first. I think we can learn from one another. I think we can learn from what China's doing. We can learn from what's happening in Germany. And they can also learn from what's happening here in the United States, especially in California and Michigan and Ohio and Arizona. Unfortunately, Georgia's not on that list yet.
Not yet, but we're working hard to get it there. So thanks, Eric. And thanks for listening to Travel Safely, brought to you by Applied Information, the show about transportation, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Today we were talking about the regulatory environment for future connected electric and autonomous vehicles. Eric, thanks so much for joining me and to helping make Atlanta and the world a better place.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Until next time, this is Bryan Mulligan signing off from Business Radio X, and travel safely.